Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachum Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by a dear friend and supporter of the podcast, Yoel Moshe Posner, wishing him much hatzlacha in everything. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the links and information in the show's notes. This podcast, we discussed Rechasim LaBikah, and while this episode was recorded a little while ago, at this time, what's available, if anyone's interested, is a sample copy of part of Bereshis and Parshas Ki Sisa, and that's available via Amazon. You can find the link in the show's notes, as well as in Lakewood. You can get it from the Mechaber. You can email him, ralashec@gmail.com. That's RALASHEC@gmail.com, and that information will be in the show's notes. Or you can reach out to me, and I'll be able to get you in touch and get you a copy. The author is still working on editing the rest of it, and you'll hear about this on the podcast, so that's still ongoing, and you can reach out to him at that email for any questions or reach out to me. You can find a link in the show's notes to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and so on. And you can also, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen. Apple, 24/6, Spotify, and so on. With that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Eliezer Cohen, who is in the middle of publishing a new edition of the Sefer Rechasim LaBikah al Torah for Yehuda Leib Shapiro of Altona, where he lived the 18th to early 19th centuries. And it's an interesting commentary. It's not really so available. I have it inside of a Mekreis Gedolos, Volume 6, Pirushei HaMikra from Yitzhak's Malchus. It's printed together with Havanas HaMikra of Rav Heidenheim, the grammarian, I guess you would call him, in Germany. And Rabbi Eliezer has it in a printed of Hebrew books. It's hard to come across. A very interesting commentary. And we'll talk about it, how we got into it, etc. So thank you, Rabbi Eliezer, for joining me.
Thank you, Nafi, for having me on. And it's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I grew up in Monsey and in Eretz Yisrael, kind of mixed, half and half. I spent first 15 or so years of my life, 5 of them I lived in Eretz Yisrael, the rest I lived in Monsey, New York. I went to Cheder Elementary School in both of those places, and my Mesicht years I was also in Eretz Yisrael. This gives me a background in Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, and it helped me to build my interest and ability to work on these types of Sfarim. After that, I learned in Riverdale, South Fallsburg. I went to learn Eretz Yisrael and Bris. Then, after I got married, I spent about 9 years in Kotel and Lakewood and BMG. And after that, I was hired as a Rebbe. I became a 5th grade Rebbe in Mir Yeshiva Ktana in Brooklyn, New York. And that was a bit of kind of a turning point in my life as far as my learning interests. Up until then, I was learning Sugyas, Gemaras, Aleph Be'iyun. And the first part of my job required me to teach Chumash Vayikra. Knowing Chumash Vayikra as a Bafuri, the man that learned in Bris, is very different than teaching it to 5th grade students. You have to actually teach the psukim and know what the words mean. And I started doing it kind of off the cuff with using whatever material other Rebbeim had given me. But I was looking for something more. I was seeking for something that would give me the tools and ability to really teach the text as a text that can be studied and learned out of, without just dumping information that doesn't have a base for it. I searched and I looked for different Sfarim, and one day I was in my father-in-law's study and I came across, totally random, a Pirush on Sefer Vayikra from the David Tzvi. And I remember standing there in the Sfarim room, opening the Sefer, turning pages. I must have stood there for about an hour, and I said to my father-in-law, I'm taking this, I need it. And that's where my more, I could say, academic type of interest in the Sefer started. I used David Tzvi Hoffman, and from him I was able to find other Sfarim that helped me. One of them being the Sefer Shem Olam from Rabbi Eliezer Lichtenstein, the Talmud of the Maral Tzins. Not a very well-known Sefer, although it was recently republished, so I guess there is some interest in that Sefer, but it's an unbelievable work as far as taking all the information, starting from the Teres Kainin to the Mishnayos, to the Gemaras, to Rishonim and Achronim, and digesting it, and then putting it back into the Pashut Pshat of the Taitros of the Pasuk. So between Darcy Hoffman, the Shem Oil, and a few other farm like that, I found myself looking at Sefer Vayikra from a totally new perspective. The words made sense, the structure made sense, the text made sense, and all the halachas that Chazal taught us, and everything down till the Rambam and the Aruch HaShulchan Asid was so set up beautifully there on the page. It made my teaching life that much different, but it also made my understanding of Chumash and Torah that much different. Getting into Darcy Hoffman, I then obviously looked for the other volumes, Bereshis and Devarim they had, and there are a few places in the Sefer of Darcy Hoffman where he quotes the Rechasim LaBikah. I kind of made a mental note of being a Sefer that I'd be curious to see. And on Shabbos, whatever parsha we were up to, a parsha Shavuot and Kriyas Torah, I would usually take the Hoffman Sefer with me to shul, go through some of the different areas on the parsha, and then I realized that he's missing the last few parshas of Sefer Bereshis. So one Shabbos, I said to myself, let's try something new. I went into Hebrew books. I found our Rechasim LaBikah. We were up to Parshas Vayechi. I printed a few pages and I started to read it, and I was hooked. I was just wowed by the Sefer. It's not comprehensive. He doesn't talk about every pasuk. He doesn't speak at length at all. We'll get more into the details of how the Sefer is structured and what he's doing. But the few little pieces on Parshas Vayechi that I saw was an eye-opener to me, and I started to get interested in the Sefer, and then I eventually downloaded the whole thing, printed some kind of form of it, and I've been working on this since then.
And now you've decided to publish it, a new edition with notes redone, and we'll talk about that as we get later on. So let's start off with the Yehuda Leib Shapiro. He lives for close to a century, so he lives a really, really long life. I think I saw his dates is 1743 to 1826, so thereabouts. I'm sure you have the exact dates. And who, so give it, talk about him, who he was, where he lived, when he lived, what time period. Are we told, well, this is the ALM, I could say, right? It's the end of the Ben Hashanah Yaakov Emden in Altona, and he goes all the way up till the early 19th century, but go ahead.
So his life is the period when he lived, and the family that he was part of are all very important pieces to understanding both the Sefer and his work and what he was trying to accomplish. As Nachi said, he was born in 1743. He was lifted in 1836. There's a quote from his Matzeva, I believe it's in Hamburg, or was in Hamburg. From what I've seen, it says that the Matzeva was Nifned Opinei Atzamas in Tuf Kuf Tzadik Vav. So it's not something we could. No, it's Tuf Reish Tzadik Vav. In any case, it's not something we could see now, as far as I can tell, but there is a copy of the words of the Matzeba, and he lived for 93 years. His family name is Shapiro. That's the original name. The family dates back to the time when the family did live in Shapiro Spires. At some point, one of his ancestors moved from there to Frankfurt, and from then on, the family became known as Frankfurter. So there's a mix of Shapiro and Frankfurter. He seemed to call himself Shapiro, but the name Frankfurter is also the family name. What is known to us more about the family than this individual, of Leib, is more the family of his brother, of Mendel. His brother, of Mendel, had a very, very famous grandson who was known as Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. Shamshon Raphael Hirsch was Shamshon. That was his first name. His second name was, or he called himself Ben Reb Raphael. Sometimes he called that to himself, but in any case, the name Raphael was the name of his father. Raphael was the son of Mendel Frankfurter, Reb Mendel Frankfurter. And Reb Mendel Frankfurter was the son of Reb Reuven Naphtali Frankfurter. And Reuven Naphtali was called Hirsch because of the name Naphtali. And that's my assumption and my best understanding of how Shamshon Raphael Hirsch got that name. Otherwise, Shamshon Raphael Hirsch would have been known as Shapiro or Frankfurter. But Reuven Naphtali, nothing is known, at least nothing is recorded that I've seen much about his life. Menachem Mendel is a person that there is a lot of writing and information about. As brother of Leib is very limited, only as far as his relation to the Sefer, and mentioned in a few places that I've seen. Mendel Frankfurter was a Talmud of Rebbeinu Leib. Okay, his brother of Leib does not say that he ever learned by Mendelssohn Leibniz. I can't say that he did or didn't, but it's not recorded that he was a Talmud. Mendel Frankfurter was known as a good bacher. He was one of the better bacher in the yeshiva, it seems. And at one point, he printed a new edition of the Torah Sabayis LaRash. There's Askama in there from Rechasim LaBikah, which is interesting, just with the style of his writing, and he gives a lot of praise to this bacher, Mendel Frankfurter. But the interesting thing is that he calls him Mendel ben Reb Tzvi Hirsch. And to the best of my understanding, that's a mistake. His name was Ruben Naftali, but he was known as Hirsch Frankfurter. So I don't know if it was, where exactly the mistake came from, but that's what it seems like happened. Mendel Frankfurter was a Seicha, he was a businessman, but at some point he became a Dayan. I didn't see clearly if he was a Dayan in Hamburg or in Altena. From my understanding, it would seem that at the time after the Napoleonic Wars or around then, there was a split between the Kehillas and they needed new Dayanim in one of them, and Mendel became a Dayan. One place says he resigned because he wanted to go back to his mitzvah, to private life. One place said he resigned, or he didn't resign, but of old age, he was he kind of gave up the shtetl. In any case, that was his public service time. The replacement for him as a dayan was Rabbi Akiva Wertheimer. That's what the history that I was able to put on. Rabbi Akiva Wertheimer was a friend of Rechasim Leib Shapiro's, and he was one of the two Haskamas, one of the two people who wrote Haskama for the Sefer. He also became the chief rabbi of Altena, and after him, the Rav was the Aruch LaNer. So that's where they kind of fit in history.
Now, this is also the time, and we'll get more into this. This is also the kind of the Haskalah. Again, he's born 1743, kind of before, but then as he grows, he lives till 1836. Well into Haskalah, Mendelssohn is 1729, 1786 around, and then there's Wesley, Naftali Hertz Wiesel, who was named, I think, 1805. So you start at the beginning of the Haskalah and the others, and you have Dubno, and all the, this is all going on at this time period. But just before even we get there, I'm going to ask you more about contemporaries, but I just want to, just as a side, I will leave this for later, but I just want to ask, because we mentioned Rechasim LaBikah, does he quote his great uncle? Does he ever quote him in the Sefer?
Yes, he does. He quotes him several times by name, and he repeats a lot of his Torah from him, not in his name. He elaborates on it. I do believe that anyone that's a serious scholar who has real interest in learning of Shapiro Hirsch's Pirushim and their sources will find a very big interest in the Rechasim LaBikah, because it did affect him, and it did have a big impact on the Shapiro Hirsch and his Pirush, and it does quote him by name a couple of times.
Okay, so as I mentioned a couple, so are there any other contemporaries that, I guess we're not going to talk about anyone from the 18th and then early 19th century, but any of the contemporaries that are pertinent to mention here that he would have came into contact with or had impact on it that you've kind of seen from Yehuda Leib or Leib Shapiro? I guess it's called Leib.
Yes. So interesting, you started mentioning the Mendelssohn Tkufa and Wesley and Dubno and all those. These people played a major part of the life story of this family, and therefore they definitely fall into this Rechasim LaBikah for various different reasons and in different ways. Just to back up, Mendel Frankfurter, when he learned, this is Rechaim Leib Shapiro's brother, the Rechasim LaBikah's brother, Mendel, when he learned in Yeshiva Rabbeinu Leibshitz in Altena, he was the Chavrusa with Naftali Hertz Wesley. He also spent time learning the Chavrusa with Moshe Mendelssohn. They both learned together under a Pirsh Levin at some point in Berlin. So I don't know exactly the dates of when, where, and how, but they were closely intertwined. They knew each other well, and they were seemingly friendly with each other, at least Mendel was. And Mendel's son, he had a son, Moshe Mendelssohn. He called himself Moshe Mendelssohn. He was Mendel's son. He was a interesting writer. He wrote a sefer called Pnei Tevel. So this would be Shapiro Hirsch's brother, Raphael's brother, Moshe. And in his sefer Pnei Tevel, when he talks about Moshe Mendelssohn, he says that I will tell you some things that I heard about Ramad, as he called him, that I heard from my father, Reb Mendel, and my uncle, Reb Leib. So there definitely was a personal connection there between them. And I'm going to back up a drop and talk about the information that I have about Reb Leib and the Sefer and a little bit about the Tkufa. Not much, again, like I said, is written or that I found written, but there was an article published in a collection of articles called Machanayim. I think it was in 1993. It was written by a Yid named Reb Zev Gotthold, subsequently reprinted in a separate collection of his own writings called Tachkamon. And he has a pretty lengthy article about the Rechasim LaBikah describing the Sefer and talking about the background of Yehuda Leib Shapiro. And in there, he mentions that Yehuda Leib Shapiro was well acquainted personally with Moshe Mendelssohn and Wesley, but at the same time, he was also very close with Rebbe Fall Hamburger and other such people who were on the opposite end of the Haskalah spectrum. And he seemed to have a close relationship and a good relationship with all of them. So he seemingly did not get into the politics of the Haskalah movement. He did get into the intellectual part of it, and we'll see as we discuss this further how he related to the Mendelssohn's beer and the things that he found in there that he didn't really like.
So before we even get into Rechasim LaBikah and where that name even comes from, what that means, I'm sure listeners are curious, but did he write anything else, or this is the only work we have of his?
So that's a very interesting question. As far as we know, this is the only work we had, meaning this is the only work that we do have. There was a very interesting article. Again, this is something that people who follow Shafshafal Hirsch would like to look up. There's a Jewish Quarterly Review. I think it's still running.
JQR, yeah.
JQR. In 1893 or 5, one of those years, a fellow named Hirsch, not related to Shafshafal Hirsch, wrote a lengthy article about Shafshafal Hirsch and his times. And in there, he mentions that Shafshafal Hirsch said something to the fact of, I will never forget the Torah that I learned from my great uncle, Reb Leib. And in the footnote, he says, this is Reb Leib Shapiro, who wrote the Rechasim LaBikah and Kol Yehuda. So there may have been another sefer that he wrote. I searched for Kol Yehuda in many different places and ways. I did not come across it. I don't think it was ever published. The only other thing that I have seen published, and I don't know if it's his actual words or it's paraphrased in the Sefer Pnei Tevel from Moshe, as he called himself, Moshe Mendelssohn. So we'll call him Moshe Mendelssohn II. In his book Pnei Tevel, he has a chapter where he discusses piyutim. And as a good, educated German linguist and proper grammar and all that, he had his own feelings about piyutim and things of them that were not properly articulated. And he writes there that his uncle, Reb Leib, told him to write a critique of a bunch of piyutim, and he has a page and a half there in that Pnei Tevel of criticisms of piyutim that he seems to be quoting from his uncle Reb Leib. So there may have been a greater work that Reb Leib Shapiro, maybe that was the Kol Yehuda, I don't know, but they're very strongly, very, very, very powerful and very strongly worded against the language of the piyutim, how they don't add up. And going through them myself and comparing them to different places in the Rechasim LaBikah where he speaks about those same words, they are definitely based on his own, on that material. So again, I don't know if it's Rechasim LaBikah himself or it's Moshe Mendelssohn building on it, but that's the other thing that I've seen written from him.
And by the way, to be clear, the Pnei Tevel heard his uncle, Moshe Mendelssohn, is because he's Mendelssohn. He's Mendelssohn, so he calls himself Mendelssohn. Right? So that's why he called that.
He was fascinated with Moshe Mendelssohn. To him, he was the greatest figure since.
But then maybe that's why he decided to call himself that. He wanted to make a plan. And so, also Rav Hirsch, Rav Hirsch was born in 1808, so he knows his great uncle to an extent. I'm sure he met him and he knows him. I don't know if he says that he does, but
he does. And there's another interesting article that I found. It's in German, so I couldn't really read it. It was one of the Yeshurans where Shafshafal Hirsch himself is writing, and I don't know the background of it, because again, besides it being in German, I don't have the previous letters or articles that were written, but it seems like Shafshafal Hirsch was accused of plagiarism. And he defends himself, and he says, I don't know the book that you're saying that I quoted from. It's not something I ever saw, and I definitely did not take from there. But I do have the Rechasim LaBikah from my uncle, and he gave it to me. My uncle gave me that sefer, and I used it all the time. And this quote may be coming from there, but it's nothing to do with what you're accusing me of. So again, I don't know the whole background of it, but the fact that he mentioned his uncle, that he had the sefer, that his uncle gave him the sefer, and he mentions it in his own pirush, there was a lot of connection there.
So let's start off with Rechasim LaBikah. What is the name Rechasim LaBikah? I don't know if about the name, and also you mentioned Haskamas earlier, so we can dive into that as well. Who gave him Haskamas? Where you got that from?
Right. So he has two Haskamas, and we'll talk about them more at length later because they're interesting. The first Haskama is from his close friend, who he calls it Akiva Wertheimer. Akiva Wertheimer who was the Rav of Altona at some point. I don't know if he was the Rav of Altona at the time that he wrote this letter, but he was a Chashiv Talmud Chacham, and a close friend of his, and he writes a Haskama. The second Haskama is from the Bezdin of Ahu, of the three communities. It's signed by Meir Weil. And this Haskama also doesn't really give a Haskama. He kind of says that we love you and we think the Sefer is great, but we don't give Haskamas, so we'll leave it at that. And we can discuss a little bit later on perhaps why they did that, unless we should get into that now.
Go ahead. You can start with that now.
This is just a short piece, but basically, one of the people that the Rechasim LaBikah critiques strongly is a fellow by the name of Yitzchak Satno. Well-known figure, infiltrated our tefillos by making some changes to the Sidurim, which seems to have stuck. But he was a curious and interesting person, and he wrote a lot of Svarim and books, and he plagiarized both ways. He wrote things b'shmai that were from other people. He wrote things from other people b'shmai. And it seems that at some point the Bezdin of Altanov or Ahu had given him a Haskama, one of the Svarim that he wrote, and they were duped because it was a fake. He said it was a different sefer, maybe it was the Rashbam on Tehillim or something like that, and they were fooled, or at least they felt that they were fooled. And after that, they made an agreement that they're not giving Haskamas on Svarim anymore. So when he asked them for Haskama, they responded that we're sorry, but we can't actually give a Haskama, but he printed in the beginning of the Sefer as a Haskama. So that's the Haskamas. So the other Haskama from Akiva Wertheimer we'll get into a little bit later on, because he does actually in the Haskama argue on something that the Rechasim LaBikah writes, and there's a big back and forth about that, which I want to discuss later on. As far as the name of the Sefer, it comes from a pasuk in Yeshaya. Kol gei yinaseh v'chol har v'giva yishpolu v'hoya ha'akad v'mishar v'Rechasim LaBikah. That's the pasuk, and he's using the words Rechasim LaBikah as the name of his sefer. So he explains himself in the Hakdama, and I'll just read two lines out of the Hakdama, and he writes, Lahashvis oyev megadef yivakesh modern utluna ube'eretz mishar yidame lirois rashi haran v'yisaftek lemedrash chachamim nevoni leiv v'tahari ruach v'samti nafshi b'kapai lahaysher haderach ulahasir michshol milifnei ivrei leiv. The objective of my sefer, he says, is to set things straight, because they have been messed up by those who have imagined to see things that weren't and turn things into other directions than they should have been. And I am going to set the record straight. And that's the Rechasim LaBikah. I'm going to take those mountains, or those imagined mountains, and flatten them out, and we can go straight to the upper.
Now, what kind of sefer is it? What are his sources, his influences, what kind of sefer? And I don't remember. This probably is important. Also, what did you say? What year it was published? Because he lived a really long life. What year it was published probably also matters to some extent.
Yes, he published the sefer himself in his lifetime in Tuf Kuf Ayin He. That's 1815. So it's later in his life, but as we said, he lived quite a long life. So he lived for another 20-something years after that, close to 30. That was the first publication. I don't know if the first edition was ever republished. I tried to find a copy of the Sefer in its original published form. I could not locate one, and I assumed from other people that it's almost impossible to get. It was published again later in Vilna, in the Tafresh Mems, but that publishing was already a different surah. It was published together with the Yehuda Leib from Wolf Heidenheim, as Nachman mentioned earlier. That's the one that's now in the Makros Delis. It may have been published a few times in Europe. It's changed a little bit, cut out the Hakdama, cut out some of the comments, and it's smaller print, harder to read, but that's the one that seemed to take off, maybe because people were also interested in Weidenheim's work, Kabbalas HaMikra. The last time it was published, to my knowledge, the Debretziner did a project of publishing Svarim at some point in the 50s and 60s. I don't know which Svarim he chose to print. I think he did the Stei Chemed, did some other Svarim. One of the Svarim he printed was this Yehuda Leib Shapiro, which is the combination sefer of the Rechasim LaBikah and both Heidenheim. If I had to guess, I would say, knowing that the Debretziner was considered himself a follower of the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer had very kind words to say about Wolf Heidenheim. It seemed to be a sefer that was liked by people who were telling the Chassam Sofer. So it could be that he decided to publish both of them together because of the way it was. I don't know if he had any particular interest in Rechasim LaBikah, but I don't know.
Yeah, this Mekores Gedolos, this Malchus, is 1969. That's when this was printed. I got it from Mizrahi. So that's like what's been floating around, but that's why you're doing it. So what are his sources? What are his influences? Who is he similar to? How does he write? I guess also, style of writing.
All of those are very detailed questions. I guess we'll try to answer the kids. His first level of influence is the classic Mefarshei Mikra. He knows the Chazal. He knows the Targum Onkelos. I don't know if I don't see him ever mention any other Targum Onkelos for sure. He quotes Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, Rashbam. Radak he doesn't quote, but it seems like the Sefer HaShoshim, I believe he does have. And that's the Rishonim, and he has tremendous respect for the Rishonim, although he may argue or feel differently or have additions. But the Rishonim are definitely a base point of where he started. Then comes the later parsha and later Mefarshim or Targumim translations. Before we get into the Jewish ones, he does critique non-Jewish translations. Matikim Loyazim, he calls them. I don't know if it's the King James Bible, the what's the German one? The Latin one. He has critique of the Targum Loyazim. It's hard to know exactly what he's critiquing because it doesn't really say what they in full sentences of what they're saying. He'll say a word or two. It could be the Vulgate, other such translations. But there's not a lot of that. But a few places he does find it important to note that what they said is incorrect. Another thing that he does talk about a lot, and that is Mendelssohn's beer. I won't say he doesn't like the beer overall, but he definitely feels that it's important to point out mistakes and inaccuracies in the translation of the beer, and sometimes in the explanations that the beer have. And I think that was a big part of the reason why he published this. He's sharp about it, although he's at the same time he's subtle. So he doesn't mention Mendelssohn by name. He does mention Yitzhak Satanov by name, and Zev Gotthold wants to say that he had a certain personal relationship with Mendelssohn, and therefore he abstained from being too sharp about it. But in one place he does call him Acher. He says, Acher, which is a pretty strong line. So I don't know if he was afraid to be too brash, but he seemed to want to keep it somewhat under the cover, under the radar, so to speak. So those are the svarim that he's using, talking about, and either adding to or arguing on.
So what impact does his sefer have? I mean, we know, as you said, that Rav Hirsch is someone that quotes him and that deals with him being related. But are there others that quote him, like Ksav Kabbalah maybe being one? Are there others that are interested, that are using him and quoting him that we see?
Yes. So from what we know, the Ksav Kabbalah, and this is well known, the Ksav Kabbalah quotes him many, many times. I think 75 times or so, according to the account of Meshach Suriel in the new edition of Ksav Kabbalah. In that Ksav Kabbalah, anybody learning that sefer will see in parentheses at the end of a piece, Reish Lamed Shin, Relash, that would be Yehuda Leib Shapiro, that's the Rechasim LaBikah. Another person that used him quite extensively around the same time is Shadal, Shmuel David Lotzato, in his Pirush on Chumash. he doesn't quote him as often, but he does mention him by name several times. But he also clearly was using him just by going through the Pirushim that he has and looking at them side by side with the Pirushim of Rechasim LaBikah. It's clear that he had the Sefer, used the Sefer, agreed with him often, disagreed with him often as well. And many times he elaborates on something that the Rechasim LaBikah writes B'Kitzur, and that's something that I did use in my footnotes when I tried to give a good explanation or a elaboration to some extent of what the Rechasim LaBikah is saying. I may use the Shadal's wording because it's well written and so.
Do we know what impact he has on Parshanei Chumash at all? Or, I mean, you mentioned just a few that quote him. I'm sure others quote him.
There's one more that I think is important, though maybe not so important because people don't know about it that much. There's a Pirush on the Ibn Ezra, 5 volumes, written by Yehuda Leib Krinsky. Later on, late 1800s, early 1900s, this has come from B'Sazal Meltzer, a very long sefer. He has 2 parts, Karni Or and Yahel Or. One of them is a short pirush, one of them is a longer pirush. He also has a pirush on Rashi. And in there, he goes to town on the Ibn Ezra. He really opens every piece of Ibn Ezra up by quoting relevant sources and comparing it and explaining it. And very often he quotes the Yehuda Leib Shapiro. He puts in parentheses Reish Vav Hey, which would be Wolf Heidenheim. But if you look at the Yehuda Leib Shapiro, which is the sefer that includes both Pirushim, these Pirushim usually are coming from the Rechasim LaBikah. So either he misquoted them or he just gave it a blanket name of Wolf Heidenheim for some reason. So that comes in a lot into the Pirush. And when you see that and how he connects it to them in Ezra, you see more how much the Rechasim LaBikah had Ibn Ezra on his table and was definitely using it a lot.
What were your sources for your understanding of Rechasim LaBikah? Are these later Mefarshim who are quoting him, you could see how they're shedding light or explaining him, or was it going back to the classical Mefarshim, seeing who he was coming from? I guess I hate to ask a double question here, but I guess this also comes to the fact that how innovative is he? I'm going to ask it to you, and how is he just quoting and working off of the classical Mefarshim of others before him, or is he really innovating? So it's different. I think it goes hand in hand with the first part of the question.
Yes, so he himself writes that when he let me back up a drop. In his Hakdama, he doesn't say much. He's very limited about the information that he wants to give us about the Sefer in his Hakdama. I would recommend anybody that wants just some interesting reading material and without taking too much time of their lives. It's a 1-page Hakdama where 3/4 of the page he goes into why Hakdamas in general have been abused. They're not really necessary. If they are there, they should just be a short, brief explanation of what the Sefer is all about. But writers nowadays go ahead and they write all sorts of things in the Hakdama and they put things that don't belong there. And Abzeb Gattel points out, and I think he's correct about that this is a critique of Mendelssohn, because Mendelssohn wrote a very long Hakdama to his Pirush on Chumash. And I think that's what he's trying to do in the Hakdama. And then he finishes off by saying that he's trying to make the Rechasim back into a Bikah. So that would seem to be, the whole Hakdama is kind of a response to the beer. But he does say in the Sharblat, he does get into more details of what he wants to do. And one of the things he says is that they may not get. He says even the Rishonim may sometimes miss something, and the Makam Yinichuli Rabbi Sai, and he does feel like he's adding to that. I don't know. Today we have a lot of Sfar. We have the Bechor Shar, and we have the Rid, the Nimukei Rid. We have a lot of Rishonim that I don't think he had, or hard for me to believe that all these things were there. When I started working on the Rechasim LaBikah and I started to footnote it and to try to understand them better, so I opened up, as much of the Rishonim that I could possibly find. And very often I do find something that he says that you can find in a Rishon. I was telling Nafi that he did a podcast that I just listened to with Professor Ken
Rabbi Professor Ephraim Kannervogel, yes.
He quoted a Pirush from the Nimukei Rid. He considered it an interesting, surprising Pirush. where he talks in Parshas Kisisa about how Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Rebbeinu Shalom Areinu Nas Todah. And the Taisus, the Nimukei Arid, says that Moshe Rabbeinu felt at that point in his life he had developed up to a level where he could ask such a question, whereas by the Sneh he had to hide himself, and he was not roy legeshes. And I noticed that the Rashbam asks it as a question. The Rashbam says, "How can Moshe Rabbeinu say Reinu as Kodecha if by the Sneh he was clearly not feeling up to such a request?" And the Rashbam therefore learns Reinu as Kodecha in a different way. But the Taisus Rid says that he developed, he grew. This Pirush, the Rechasim LaBikah says, not word for word. It's hard for me to believe that he copied it or saw it, because none of the words that he uses are the same. And other places where he's saying over something that he clearly saw in the Rashbam, who used similar words. So I think that he came up to this pshat by himself. But yes, you may find it in the Rishon. You may find it in other songs that came out later or earlier.
So has your work been, for example, like that? So now you get up to that shtickle. Are you going to now say, B'kaf Kosav Nimukei Rid, but Rabbeinu didn't have him? Is that something? Or
Well, I will say Kaf Kosav, that I will quote the Rid if it's relevant, and I try to find as much of that as I can. I think that the Sefer to itself, it's not like it's a Sefer that was written by a Gadol B'Yisrael that everybody knows and are dying to hear the words that he says. As great as he may have been, he's an unknown person. So I think that what will carry weight is the Sefer itself. And by comparing and contrasting and bringing in footnotes of similar or different Pirushim, I think that gives it a framework, and I think that makes it much more user-friendly and interesting to people.
Yeah, to digress here for a second with a personal comment, my Torah time and Masechta Avodah Zarah, I did kind of the same thing. He had no Svarim, Rav Chaim Shor and Avodah Zarah at the time, and he had just the Rishonim, basically. There was nothing printed. And many times he's mechavet to the Ramban, he's mechavet to the Ravid, and they say and he didn't have them. He didn't have any of it. The Ritzvah didn't have it. So I tried to do a Kakosab, because it's worth mentioning he didn't have it. So I think it's the same type of thing. A lot of when you see Svarim being written, even though Leib Shapiro is later, you want to, tell the reader, by the way, this is what he had, this is what he said, like, either because he's coming from there. We have a lot of Mefarshim that it's not a plagiarism thing. They were taking from his oldest Svarim and not, repurposing it, repackaging it, your old version of a Likud Sefer. But you have a lot that they were Mechavim, they didn't have these Svarim. And they didn't, reminds me of, like some of this just reminds me, we're getting off topic, but it reminds me that the Rabbi Kravitz, when he saw in the Svarno, originally he said when he did the work for his Valdo, he thought the Svarno was coming from Barbanel, but then he has the Amar Agoin, the Svarno Shiurim, and he sees he's coming from Akedah, because he's quoted, his Talmud's quoting him, he's quoting. Now, in his Sefer, the Svarno doesn't quote anyone. He's not quoting him, he's not telling you where he's coming from, but he was clearly, he was reading it and working with it. Here, like you're saying, sometimes he's reading it, sometimes he's not working with it. He's just being Mechav, and he's coming from the, those Rishonim. Now, what style, I don't know if you can give a flavor for it recently, what style, see, this time period that he's writing in, some of the Svarim are written easier, some are harder, some are more flowery, grammary. What style, how's it written? What's the style? Is it easy to read? You said you're Israeli partially, so for you, it's much easier, but what's the style of the Sefer it's written?
The short answer is no, it's not easy to read, and that's why I feel that the Sefer has been off the bookshelves. All these generations and all these specialists have used it. The Tzava Kabbalah could read it, and even the Tzava Kabbalah, the pieces that he quotes are usually the easier ones. I was getting back to your point about the Teres Chaim. There are a few writers, later generation writers, that somehow write like Rishonim. Right? I think the Teres Chaim would be one of them. Another one that I find maybe is a good comparison to the Rechasim LaBikah on Gemara would be the Gon Yaakov on Eruvin. Anyone that learns the Gon Yaakov, learns Eruvin Be'iyon and learns the Gon Yaakov, he had the Rishonim and sometimes he quotes them, but he writes like he's part of the Rishonim. He's like he's in the parish, he's in the group. The Rechasim LaBikah writes like a Rishon to a certain degree. He writes, he's decisive, he's short, he says what he wants to say, and he doesn't elaborate, and he doesn't try to show where he's going different unless he has a point that he wants to make. I'll just give you an example of where he does something interesting. In the beginning of Bereshis, Tayu Bavayu. This piece is interesting on many levels, but one part of it is that he is basically repackaging a Rashban. And I was curious what he's doing And I noticed something interesting. He says, Toyu v'vayu, I'll read the piece, it's 3 lines. Shneim toyer echad, when you put them both together, Toyu v'vayu, that's one description. Laharekus hagamon, total emptiness. Hamavil esleif haroya, frightens one who sees it. Come on. And then he brings 3 psukim to prove that point. Ra'isi sa'aretz v'hine toyu v'vayu. Ra'isi v'hine ein adam safsa behema v'oif. I'm sorry, I read that too fast. Ra'isi v'hine ein adam, that's 2. And the third one is safsa behema v'oif. And those are both psukim in Yirmiyah in 2 totally different places. And I'm not going to get totally into that. But really the Rashbam says. And so thinking about it, trying to understand what is he doing different than the Rashbam, I realized that the Rashbam, there's 4 words here that he adds that the Rashbam doesn't say. And those are hamavil eslev haroy. So the Rashbam does say it's reikus gamor, which I think is an important point that he wants to bring out. But he also says hamavil eslev haroy, that it's a frightening, for someone to see it, to behold it. And one of these 3 psukim, he brings 3 psukim, the Rashbam only brings 2. The third one is to prove this point. Safsa behema v'oif is coming to prove this point. So it's very interesting if you read it unto itself, you're not going to see much, because it's very hard to decipher what he's doing and where he's going. But if I point out in the footnote that he's kind of paraphrasing the Rashbam, but bringing the third pasuk to show an added layer, I think that makes the sefer much more interesting and usable to somebody who's interested, whether it's the Rashbam or a different sefer that's going to be quoting a similar idea on this pasuk.
Yeah, because it's quite terse, and like you said, he writes, comparing it to a Rishon. So what would you say is the overall derech, the mahalach, the overall, thrust of the commentary is what?
So the commentary is language-based. That would be number 1. And he again speaks about this in the Shar, Daf HaShar. He says kind of what he wants to do. And I pulled out 3 main points that I think he's trying to do, and all of them are really to the same objective. Number 1, he says like this: "Well, Yisoy Siach Sfas Kodesh Umaskunta HaBinyan VaHaGizra." To correctly understand the words and the binyanim of the words, the shurashim of the words, and then he adds, everything is going to be proven. Anytime he wants to say something new, he's going to use different places in Tanakh that same word is used. And he has an agenda here, because one of the things he says is that other writers, hoisifu al hamida. And so if Aremois Kefkomois Mikrois Mikisya Kodesh, Vigarshin Mimakaimon Vishana Estano. So one of the things that other writers do wrong is that they try to compare words in Kisya Kodesh, and they totally mess them up by moving them out of place. Now, I'm going to do the same thing and show you different places in Tanakh where the same word is used and how it's used, but I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to show you how the word there is being used in the same way that it's used here. And he does that a lot, which in his short 3-4 lines on a piece, half of it may be going off topic to explain the word in the other place and show how it fits into here. And so that's 2. Number 1 is the actual wording and understanding the Lashon HaKodesh of it, and the correct usage of the word be'ivri, as he calls it. He doesn't like Hebrew. He doesn't like modern Hebrew. He doesn't like words. Even when the Chazal uses a word similar in Mishnayos, he'll point out that that's a Mishnaic term. It's not something that's not Tanakh. There's one word that he really goes ballistic on, and it's a much bigger story, but in it you see this point where he talks about teva, and he says, if I remember correctly his words, ein teva be'ivri ki in shkia b'chemer v'tit. Teva means litvaya, to sink. Does not mean nature.
That's the Nieto controversy with the Chacham Tzvi and the London and Spinoza stuff. That's the whole Nieto set.
And he dances around that topic. He speaks very strongly, and he calls somebody, without giving him a name, I have to read the piece, so I have it here, where he, I wasn't going to get there yet, but I may as well. He's definitely referring to Spinoza, I believe. Be'echad midaros achreinen, hoilid echad mima'atikin, milas teva, she'en le'zecher b'chol divrei chachamim harishonim. There's no such word as teva, right? That's his word issue. V'yadua she'en teva be'ivri ki im shkia b'tit v'chema. Ve'en lo inyan b'minhag u'mida v'derech. It has nothing to do with nature. The Acharov, and this is where he gets really strong, Hechzik kol shege umashke, the damu kishem me oilam nitenlai, that there was always such a word, Acha sifu sara lidrosh by gematria shel daifi. That they make the gematria, what the gematria doesn't say, but I think we all know it means the gematria of Teva is gematria Halakim, and I've seen it as sourced by Spinoza.
Yeah, this is classic. I mean, this goes back to Nieto on divine providence, universal nature, which is never translated, and they accused him of Spinoza, in the community in London, and then they wrote to the Rechasim Tzvi, who was backed up to Nieto. It's in Shuvas Rechasim Tzvi. Yeah. So this whole. What's interesting here, just to point out,
I have those in my footnotes. So those will be coming in.
Yes, you have those. So just the interesting point here is, and at least I picked up, one of the listeners have picked up, is that the Rechasim LaBikah has often an agenda, and he's often subversively. He's almost like, I think the modern quote would be like a subtweet. He's like suddenly going after someone somewhere very often here. Is this something that he does throughout the Sefer?
He does. He does. And this issue, I think, was the one of the biggest ones. And I'll take it even a step further, because this issue with Spinoza and pantheism and Elikim, and, according to legend, Mendelssohn died from that. I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but I'll say it over the Kitzur. I've seen it in different places and in different versions. But basically what seems to have happened is that Moses Mendelssohn had a friend named Lessing. Lessing was a German playwright, maybe somewhat of a philosopher. And Mendelssohn liked him a lot. It seems like Lessing was very pro-Jews and some level of giving the equal rights. And Mendelssohn was working with him on that. And there was another fellow named Jacobi who was not happy with this whole thing. We know there was a lot of backlash. We know the Labatar story. I'm not going to get into it now, but there was a lot of back and forth at different sides of this issue. The story goes that when Lessing died, Jacobi wrote an article accusing Lessing of being a Spinozist, so following pantheism, where God and nature are all one, and he accused Lessing of being part of that. Mendelssohn went ahead and defended Lessing, and he wrote an article, he wrote another article, and according to the way it's written in the Pnei Tevel, he basically just, got so involved in this and so upset about it, and he put in so much effort and energy to writing articles about him, to defend Lessing, that he actually got sick from it and he died. There's another legend that goes that he was running off to the publishing house to print his final letter defending Lessing, and he didn't take his coat. It was Motzei Shabbos. Ran home and he got to the printing house and he published it, and then he got sick and he died. So I would guess that this was an issue there in Berlin, Hamburg, that whole Kufa. And the Rechasim LaBikah doesn't really want to talk about it too much, but on the other hand, he wants to start the record straight. I will add that in the beginning of Bereshis, Frankfurter Hirsch does have a pretty long piece where he talks very clearly about this issue with Elohim not meaning nature, and seems to be following the same issue, and a lot of his words are similar to the Rechasim LaBikah. So it seems that he was following up on this from his great uncle, which was a parsha that, as you said, it's a subtweet. He doesn't want to talk about it too much, but he does want it out there. He does want it spoken there.
So that Rechasim Tzvi is Tshuva Yud Ches. I think in the podcast with Professor Matt Goldish, I did discuss this David Nieto and the Rechasim Tzvi. It's a famous discussion. Okay, back to the Sefer. So, where were we? I guess which parts?
So we're talking about. So that was the word issue, right? Getting into the words. So the words, people think that words are just words, but it seems like there's maybe issues of life and death sometimes with how you translate a word. So and the second Nakuda was after the word itself was the usage of the word in other places and comparisons. And the third thing is Tamei HaMikra, Piskei HaTaimim. And I was talking to this with a very frustrated Yid, and he said, you have to be careful because he uses the term Menichei HaTaimim, Chazal. Also Mishmah Sinai. I don't want to get too much into that, but just as a word of caution, he does use that terminology, Menichei HaTaimim, that there's a human element. Maybe they wrote the little symbols, but the actual Kriya is Sinai irrelevant. The point is that he does use the Piskei HaTaimim. He's here. His lashon is Hema Yizdu Tachamim Yayatze Kedem L'Cheker Aboysan Tahari Leiv Taku Yasid B'Makom Neman Hi'iru Or L'Halchei Chashechem. That the Tamei HaMikra are lights that direct you how to read the psukim, and he uses the Tamei Mikra often as a means to how to read the pasuk, and sometimes he'll develop a pretty wild or extreme chiddush based on the Tamei Mikra. Not so much in Chumash, but in Tehillim a lot with the Tamei Emes. He finds chiddushim that are kind of unique and chiddushik, and he's building it on the usage of words, but also strongly on the Tamei Mikra. And if you want, I could give you one example of that now.
Go ahead.
Related. We all say in Mizmor Shechel K'Sabayis David, Hashem b'Tzaycha. Can you read the pasuk for me so I could it will help me to just say it. How do you know Hashem b'Tzaycha? Go on. Mata lahari. Oh, it's start to Fanecha Yisiniv. Okay. Hashem b'Tzaycha. So everybody will look at this. Hashem b'Tzaycha. Mata lahari. Oh, right. Then I said start to Fanecha Yisiniv. And this piece is in Vayichi when he's talking about by Pakas Kamayim al Taisik Beruven, right? Has it start? Ruven b'chari atarish v'koiches aini yasu se'es yasu us. So what does the word us mean? It's a very long piece and it's complicated, but he does come out that ois with a chaylam is used often as a tayar to Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Ha'ois, the mighty one, Hamachtiger as he calls. Then he says, so let's read this pasuk and look at the Tamei Mikra. He says under Lahari, there's a Mahapach Elav Yered, which is looked up to us like a Mahapach Pashta. He says that is actually the Esnachta in Tehillim, which is where a pasuk is broken in half. The second strongest mapsik aside from a Seif pasuk. So, being that the Mahapach Elav Yered is under Lahari, the pasuk should be read like this: Hashem b'Tzaycha Hemadata Lahari. The way it reads, assuming, like you said, that Oiz is a Torah for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now we have a little poem, the two-line poem with the Davar V'Yipucha. Hashem b'Tzaycha. Hashem when you were at will. And that's another piece where he talks about b'Tzayna Mikusha. Ratzain means the opposite of anger. Hashem b'Tzaycha. Hashem when you were not angry. Hemadata Lahari. You stood me up like a mountain. You gave me strength to stand up tall. Ois, however, you Hashem, at the time that you were master upon it, Ois. So the Hashem and Ois are the two words at the first half of the statement expressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the first half is saying Hamat al-Hari, and the second one is the start to Fanecha. So if you're going to read the pasuk like him, every person that says to him says it wrong. It's Hashem b'Tzaycha Hamat al-Hari, Ois the start to Fanecha. Now, on this exact pasuk, I checked how Frankfurter Hirsch in his Tehillim says it, and he does not say that at all. And he actually says that Lahari, he's down if Lahari and Oiz are together, not together, but he clearly does not have this pshat. And I think that if you look at the end of the Pirush of Tehillim of Frankfurter Hirsch, he talks about the Tamei Mikra of MS. I think he has a different way of reading the Mahapach of Yered. He splits them. So this is a case where he does not have his great uncle's pshat. He does not agree with it. And I think he disagrees with the whole side of how to read the Trop in Tehillim.
So I think we should talk about more examples now before we talk about your work and what's coming out and what you did on it and things like that. I think so. We spoke about the Akdama, which is interesting. We talked about the Askamas, which is interesting. I think talking about the commentary maybe will make sense. And, to start off, I mean, we have examples, but I want to just go first of all more to the agenda stuff, because I think that's fun and the listeners will enjoy that. You mentioned some examples, and you mentioned to me something from the new Aksava Kabbalah, Moshe Tzuriel, that I think is fascinating that you came across. That is another kind of agenda subtweet going on in the Rechasim LaBikah. I think that would be interesting. And I don't know if you have any other... Again, I'm not looking to just highlight these kind of examples, because he's not everything. He has an agenda going after someone. But I think it's interesting that he was, and especially, with the beer, with Mendelssohn and Yusim al-Haskalah, he is kind of pushing back on some of that. You see it at times, which is interesting.
Yeah, I want to get to that one, and I will do that in a second. I just want to finish up, because I started talking about the Tayu Vavayu piece. And the end of this piece, he has a critique on Mendelssohn, and he has an extremely cute play on words, which it took me a while to pick up, but I'm pretty sure that that's what he means. I'm just going to back up a drop. He says that Tayu Vavayu means Rekus Gomer, absolute nothingness. And then he says, V'ametargumay mashchas tzura. One who translated it as mashchas tzura, of a form, a ruined form, a form that's not complete. And he brings the Yiddish word unfirmly. Loi tirgen klum. Sherekus davar she'enayu, because rekus is nothing. So I was thinking about this, and I said, well, what does he mean, loi tirgen klum? He uses different words very often when he's disagreeing with Mendelssohn's translation of the beer. This unformed luft is Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn translates Torah as unformed mass, I guess you could say. But he says, "V'atargum mashchas tzura, lo tirgem klum." I think that he's using a play on words here and saying he was not mitargum correctly because the correct targum should have been klum, and he did not go with that, and he translated incorrectly. That's just a cute way. I think it's a little bit, like I said, a pun. He wants to critique Mendelssohn and get your attention. There are other places like that. There's another one I'll talk about later. But moving on to, this example that we were discussing earlier about something that's in the Ksava Kabbalah and may have been misunderstood. I'm not sure exactly what happened here. It goes like this. In Parshas Kisisa, the pasuk says that you should keep Shabbos, and the pasuk says, "Bein Yebein Bnei Yisrael Oisi Kishesh Yam." It's talking about the Isim Malach on Shabbos, and the Isim Malach on Shabbos is an Ois Kishesh Yam Bar Hashem Shemanis Arts. And he says pretty simple: He Ois Viraya Uzikaron She'asa Hakol B'Shesh Yamin Ubashrini Shabbos. We keep Shabbos. It's an Ois. It's a Zikaron that Hashem created everything. Then he says, "Ki Zeh." This key in this pasuk. That the word ki over here means she. So if you read the pasuk correctly, it's an ice that Hashem created the world. Well, pasuk zeh, therefore he says this pasuk destroys divrei echad mechikakei leiv b'mitzvah Shabbos b'divrei sakrants. That's all he says. Divrei echad mechikakei leiv. The mitzvah Shabbos Divrei Sakrants. What is he referring to, and what is he so upset about? So if you look in the Haksava Kabbalah, a friend of mine showed me that this is probably what he means, and I think he's correct. The Haksava Kabbalah has a long arichos in the Dvarim and the Stana, where he goes into what are the reasons for the mitzvahs of Shabbos? And he wants to differentiate between the Kedusha of Shabbos, the fact that we keep Shabbos as a special day, and the Isum Malacha of Shabbos. He comes out that the mitzvahs Shabbos, the Isum Malacha of Shabbos is different than the Kedusha of Shabbos. In Cain, he says, Yitzias Mitzrayim eneno hatam l'shmiras Shabbos. Yitzias Mitzrayim is not the reason for shmiras Shabbos. אבל הטעם האמיתי הוא when I הכוסף אקל שבססת תשמרו כי אויסי ביני ובינכם ודרעיכם לדעס כי אני השם מקדשם. The main point of keeping Shabbos is to know that Hashem is Mekadesh Klal Yisrael. שפשוט ירא כי השם נשא לנו השבוס למען תהיה לנו לאויס שאנחנו עמה. ולכן אנו שייכסים ביום השביעי כמו ששבוס בי השם נסברך אחר הבריאה. יום השביעי שלו הוא גם יום השביעי שלנו. That the Kedusha of Shabbos is to remind us. The Kedusha of Shabbos is what's reminding us of Yitzias Mitzrayim, and he says the same thing about Bria, about Sheshem Masa Hashem. It's a long piece. I just read the end of it where he's talking about Yitzias Mitzrayim, but he says the same thing about Bria Shemayim V'Aretz. And the end of the piece in the Ksava Kabbalah, he puts in parentheses 3 letters, the way we have it here in the print of the Masada of Kook, Yud Shin Resh. Who is Yud Shin Resh? So if you look at the beginning of the Ksava Kabbalah put out in Masada of Kook, he says that Yud Shin Resh, the Yud Shin Resh is somewhere else. He has here Shir, Shin Yud Resh, right? There's two different things, Yud Shin Resh and Shin Yud Resh. Let me backtrack. Sorry, I'm confusing you. The end of that piece in Dvarim, where the Ksava Kabbalah has Yashar, he notes, Kain hu b'Maduras Taf Kuf Tzadik Tes. In the subsequent Madura, the Ksava Kabbalah changed it from Yashar to Shir. And he says here, now going back to the Mavoy, in the Rishima Sasfar V'Makabim, in the first volume of Ksava Kabbalah, from Sada Rakut, from Meshach Zuriel, he says, Shir. He has an entry under Shir. Who is Shir? Shimesh Ad Bezdin in Prague, B'Shas Nas Tafresh Chof, Nulchan, but Kifus Negat Fusar Farman. This is Reb Shlomo Yehuda Ratable. Then he says, he brings this pasuk in Varm Hey Tesvav, B'Madura Taf Kuf Tzadik Tes, L'Pasuk Kanal Litfas Yashar, V'hu Adam Asher, it's someone else. Ein B'Yodan Rafkroim Zitos or Tikkun Tos. If this is a mistake or something was changed by mistake, and therefore he chose to move in Yashar at the end of the piece in Vestana. Yud Shin Reish is Yitzchak Shmuel Rigia. I don't think that he has him here on this list of names, but he has him as a name of one of the people that he feels that the Ksava Kabbalah removed. If you look at footnote number 10. Footnote number 10 on that same page where he has Rappaport, he says that there are several people that the Ksava Kabbalah had in his first edition and that he removed because he didn't feel that they were up to snuff, up to par in their emunah or in their reform or whatever it may be that he didn't like. The same Nag, I'm reading here from Tzuriel, the same Nag and Yitzchak Shmuel Rigia. Shebamadur is Tav Kuf Tzadik Tes Hevi Devraim, and the Madur is Tav Rishman Hishmit Devraim. So I don't have both editions with Ksava Kabbalah, and I don't remember offhand if there's other places where we have currently where he does quote Reggio. But this piece, if you open up Reggio's book, it's there. It's there. So what I'm guessing happened, and pardon me if I'm making assumptions, but what I'm thinking may have happened is that the Ksava Kabbalah quoted this piece originally from Yashar. In the subsequent Madura, he removed quotes from Yashar, but he liked this word. So he kept it in, but he did a Sikul that he changed it from Yashar to Shir.
What's so interesting is, first of all, the fact that they write Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport as like, what is he fighting against reform? I mean, Rappaport, yeah, but he was, one of the Rosh Maskilim. He was notably the K'tzais son-in-law, the K'tzais Zaydim. He's the Magia on Avnei Meluim. For those that know and those that don't know, don't know. But that's who Shir is.
Far-fetched to assume that the Tzavak was quoting.
Also, Shir didn't write a commentary on Chumash. He was a historian. He wrote Erech Milin. He wrote a lot. He wrote Svarim, but he wasn't that. He was a Rav. It's interesting. But the other thing about Yashar is, so Yashar, Shmuel Riggio was a contemporary of Shadal. He was a real maskil, as far as I remember. He wrote the thing about shaving on Chol Hamoed, and that's where Meir Ben Yoel was Teklachas B'Chol Hamoed. And his father, I think, attacked him on it. His father was a Rav Rami Riggio, who was a big Makubal. He's discussed at length in Moshe Hillel's new book on Ramon Chashmul Garandi, the Rav in Padua, Tam Shadal, the author of the Toldos Daily Sof Gane Italia, a history book on the Rabbanim of Italy. And he considered himself a Talmud over Rav Riggio in Kabbalah. This is Yashar's father, but Yashar was in Gorizia. He was a big maskil. He put out also a beer and translation into Italian with a beer, 5 volumes on Chumash, kind of inspired by Mendelssohn. I think he liked him. Shadal, quotes him. It doesn't. They were different than Yashar. Yashar also he published Bechinas Hadas of Delmedigo, and it was late 15th century, early 16th, late 15th actually. And he kind of spins it into this anti-Kabbalah, kind of into this maskilic program. He also publishes Ari Naim from Ridai of Madana with his notes and things like that. So he's busy with that. What's interesting is I found this, someone reprinted Reggio without the commentary. Then it's gone out of print. I don't know why, but someone did it. Interesting, like a sefer. Also, this Eraisa Mimara in Italia, which is a sefer by Shimon Wanunu, Rabbi Shimon Wanunu, and he's published a lot of Svarim. He publishes Likud. He publishes these fascinating, Likutim, and he, like on various topics, Eliyahu Navi, and he publishes history, sometimes he's just taking from a different place, like a history entry, like almost like a Wikipedia, on a couple of different things. But he has this sefer where he quotes various Italian Rabbanim. Now, Shadal is not in there, but one of the people quoted is, at the end of the shtickle, Harav Hagoyin Rabbi Yitzchak Shmuel Riggio. He says, Megedoyle Rabbani Italia, Umeshalsheles Rabbanim Uflogim. Now, it's true that Riggio was a rabbi and he was from Rabbanim, but Riggio is definitely a maskil. It's very interesting. I found that to be very interesting that he was quoted in there. But what you're saying about, as far as I recall from Rosh Hashanah's like Dama, he does mention like Shadal was quoted and he takes him out. He left him in, he took him out, like Ksava Kabbalah, but he does leave these quotations in.
He left Shadal in fully. He left Wesley in fully. Here we have a piece where it seems like he was hesitant about Yashar. And this whole topic of who's a maskil and who's not, it's like, you could beat yourself to death on it. But I was reading some article online about, the only other place where I found someone talking about the Rechasim LaBikah is the articles really about the Ksava Kabbalah and the Malbim, and he writes how the Ksava Kabbalah sometimes quotes Maskilin, such as Wesley, such as Shadal, and such as the Rechasim LaBikah. And I'm thinking to myself, you missed the boat. I mean, maybe the Rechasim LaBikah may have fallen into that group socially, but he was, there's nothing about him that's screaming maskil other than the fact that he likes learning Chumash and understanding the words properly. But I do want to say something, just an interesting thought that I had about this whole project and this whole, the society and our understanding of it, and how we as, people 200 years later, formed by opinions that, probably taken out of context. And we end up with an interesting mishmash of who's who and what's what. But in our society, I would say like this: we have the original beer. I don't know if this is correct. The original beer was a project designed by 3 people, more or less: Mendelssohn, Wesley, and Dubno. In the play table that I mentioned earlier, he goes on at length how Mendelssohn didn't get a haskama for the sefer, for the beer, and he says, because he writes this in his letter to his friend Alam, whatever that may be, Victor something, he writes that I didn't get a haskama because I was originally writing just some, taich of the Chumash for my kids, and then Shlomo Dubno pushed me to publish it, so I published it, but I wasn't really trying to do anything new, so I didn't feel like I needed a haskama. Of course, if I print something that's mechudash, I'll get a haskama. So I was thinking about these 3 people, right? Mendelssohn, Dubno, and Wesley, and how we perceive them now in our generation as who they are and may be, or where they fit into society. And it occurred to me the Medrash of Chazal by Havan Iskakmala. It says Shloisha Hayu Ba'isa Eitza Bilam Yisrael Ve'iyos Bilam Shiyat Nerag Iyov Shasak Nidam B'Yisur, and Yisrael Shebarach Yeshua Banav Lishkas Agazis. Right? And we have here Mendelssohn, Wesley, and Dubno. I would say Mendelssohn Shiyat Nerag. Socially, in our circles, he's dead. I know someone's trying to chase on Mason with the Jewish Observer in the 90s. That resurrection didn't really work. He's dead. Right? He was the Yayitz. Dubno Shebarach, Yeshua Bana B'Lishkas Agazis. You ask anybody about Shlomo Dubno, he's the tzaddik in the parsha. He ran away because he felt that the whole project was treif. Yeah, he tried to reprint the sefer by himself, but they got a skull. And Wesley Shashasak Nidan B'Yisurim. Wesley is kind of a bridge in between. And his Nidan B'Yisurim he's a tough person to figure out. There are people that want to have his permission, people want to have his Sfarim printed, people that don't want to have his Sfarim printed. Somebody told me that they asked the sniper to print his Wesley's Sfarim. And he said something to the effect of, the Sfarim are great, and I'll give a haskama, but I can't give a haskama to print Sfarim of somebody who caused half of Yiddishkeit to go off to death. And I'm not going to argue on the sniper, chas v'shalom, but what I will say is that is the social perception. He's needed to be Yisurim, he's torn. We can't publish him, but we want to publish him. And Dubno's a tzaddik, and Mendelssohn's a Rasha. It's just an interesting way of how the world is, and we have to live with that.
Yeah, I think I remember Rabbi Victor Miller, one of his books says Wesley was a naive man who dwelt in the clouds, or something like that he calls him naive. He doesn't call him a Rasha. Interesting, Rabbi Victor Miller. Just to quote someone contemporary that listeners may be familiar with talking about Wesley. Wesley is kind of complex farm. Some of his farm had to be reprinted. I think Rabbi Shapiro was behind that. But yeah, definitely. I mean, this is all, we're coming later. But what's interesting to me about this whole thing is the Rechasim LaBikah and his kind of attitude and his perception, his quoting and sub-quoting all these farm. By the way, Wesley, who wrote the beer on Vayikra, is quoted extensively by Rav Hirsch in his commentary on Vayikra.
So this goes back to that family story that I was saying before. Wesley was part of the family. He was literally part of the family. He was chavrusis with the Mendel Frankfurter. Rav Hirsch had all the kisvei yad of Wesley were in Rav Hirsch's possession, including a prince on the Ramban, from my understanding. It doesn't exist, but it was there. And Rav Hirsch quotes him by name. The beginning of Tazria, and he says Wesley's pshat is only pshat to understand what it means, that was white. It looks white. It wasn't white. There's no question that Rav Hirsch was a fan of Wesley. And I will say this: they printed the Imre Shefer on Bereshis from Wesley, and there's a lot there that's so similar to what the Rechasim LaBikah is saying that I couldn't not use it as a reference to either elaborate or to show a different point of view. But it's so much in the same ballpark.
Interestingly, also, they printed his Vayikra, which is in the beer, and they called it Pshuta Shomikra, and they removed also in the beer, Mendelssohn has comments and notes, I think it's in brackets or parentheses, they removed all that. So you just have the original pure Wesley. I don't remember if they even used the manuscript, or they just used it from the beer and they changed the name.
And Mendelssohn did not like Wesley's beer, which is why he wrote these comments in Hars. That's a very interesting point.
So what other examples do we have from Rechasim LaBikah besides him? I don't know besides. It could be him also going after others. But what other commentaries do we have, examples that you can give to listeners?
So let me give some examples of interesting points that he makes. Some are just, ways to read words, which, give us a little bit flavor to the title of the pasuk. And some of them really give us a lot more to think about than things to, in our Yiddishkeit that may open things up to us. I'll give you an example of something that he gets into in words, which he says, the Rishonim may have overlooked some things. I don't know exactly that's the right way to say it, but he does say something like that. And that is, the word Terem. When he says that the Edir Ba'aretz, the pasuk says, Terem Yitzmach. He says there's a very big difference between Terem and Biterem. He says, B'davar shekvar ovar yomar Terem. Didn't happen yet. Rashi, there he agrees with Rashi. Something that didn't happen yet, but it will happen. Ragul Yosef b'milas b'terem, as in b'terem avienu. And this is a subtle difference, he says, that he believes that the Rishonim miss. And Ezra, he says, nitchak b'shtehen, as kol aksuvim me'idim kumavor. So if you open up this, unpack this sugya, and I'm not going to do it here now, but you find the Ibn Ezra that talks about Arichas, about Terem and Biterem, and the Ramban agrees with him. They're not mechalek between Terem and Biterem, and therefore they're stuck with certain places where the word doesn't seem to add up, or doesn't seem to mean the same thing, and they're kind of, I won't say confused because they're Rishonim, but they don't seem to have a clear path. And he says if you just take this chiluk between a Beis Biterem or without a Beis Terem, you'll see that there's a very big difference, and the Mela, everything else flows smoothly. He does the same thing with Rashis and Birashis. One of them is Samuch, one of them is not necessarily Samuch. That's one example. That's an example of just a word where he points out a small variance which you could take to many different places and use it understand different psukim. I will also mention before I go any further that his sefer is 150 pages in his original print, not very big. And of those 150 pages, I think a third of it, or maybe more, is Bereshis, and most of it is Parshas Bereshis. And he writes somewhere, I don't remember where I saw it, but he said that he's really just giving you keys and clues. So he's packing it heavy in the beginning, but you have to use your mind later on and try to unpack psukim based on what he'll give you. You said this earlier. He has psukim where he talks about what does Yeh mean, what does Eretz mean, what does Amar mean, what does Ki mean. So he's almost like a word book, but he most of the time uses it in the psukim in the beginning of Bereshis, and then you're supposed to be able to understand later on how it works. Another word that he defines, and he mentions a few places in the Sefer, but it opened up my mind to a lot of interesting thoughts, and that is the word Haggadah. What does Lahagid mean? And he says it means not necessarily something that you speak, but something that you convey by circumstance or by action. And he says this in a few places. He starts it in the beginning of in Bereshis when Higid L'chak, Arimata Hashem says, who told you? Then he repeats it again in by Yaakov and Lavan, Higid L'shu by Reas. And he says the same thing in the Parshas Kisavoy, Higati Ayem Hashem L'kecha. It doesn't mean that I said anything. Higati Ayem, Her Eisi Hayem Ba'avas Bikurim Elu, I showed with the Abbas Bikurim that I have come. So just bringing the Bikurim is telling the story of what I'm trying to, what I'm thinking and how I feel about the Beis HaMikdash and how I feel about the Paris that came from Hashem. The Haggadah is in the Hava itself. I'm going to read a piece from Bereshis where he elaborates a little bit more. Yesh Haggadah she'ena b'peh, elo hiras machshava al-yedei mais. shows a thought by means of an action. And he says, Yehuda Leib Shapiro Frankfurter, and I haven't yet spoken, so obviously it doesn't mean to say it. And then he says, interesting thing, Ma'aseh Yadav Magid Rakia. Ma'aseh Yadav of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Magid Rakia. Does the sky speak? The sky doesn't speak. When we perceive the Shamayim, that is, we see Ma'aseh Yadav of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem is telling it to us through our seeing and our perception of nature. Then he says the same thing was with Sipor. With Sipor, Hashemayim Misapim Kvoidet, the same idea, Mar. And the next example is fascinating. L'man Tesapru L'dor Achrim. We say to him, L'man Tesapru L'dor Achrim Kizel Kimelechenu. There's Shisim L'doleh, build up Yerushalayim, build up the city. L'man Tesapru L'dor Achrim. The Dor Rishon has no way of talking to the Dor Achrim. They're conveying with their actions, with their building, with their construction, that there's a beautiful city here, and the Dor Achrim will read into it. And to me, this is, it's not just Pshat and the Pasuk, but it affects my way of thinking about what it means, Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim and Haggadah Shel Pesach. We're not just people who talk. We have to live a certain life, and that life is supposed to tell over the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim. The Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim and the Haggadah Shel Pesach, based on this understanding of what the Rechasim LaBikah gives me, it tells me that there's a lot more to perception and a lot more meaning to the way you convey the way you show yourself and the way you act amongst others, that gives them the ability to read and to understand and to almost as if you're talking to them without actual words. So I find that to be a very good example of where his elaboration of the word gives us a lot to think about.
I mean, you've given some examples. I don't know if any others want to give. It's a very interesting sefer. As you said, it's not long. It's not going to be a lot. But what's your work kind of been? So, as you said, at this point, it's not available. I mentioned these different things. It's not really available. I mean, you can find it online. You read books. But you can't go to the farm store and purchase it. What about it for those that aren't? I still hope to do an episode on Al Torah with Hillel Novetsky. For those that haven't used alatorah.org, please do. It's fantastic. It's got everything there, and not everything, but it's got a lot of things there and great editions, new custom editions. Like they've done Rashi and other things. They're always working, always adding. They're adding Torah Shlema now. When we're recording this, maybe it's there already when we put it on, and many other things. So, have you given alatorah? What's become with that and the new edition? I realized I just lumped a couple questions together again. But everything about your new edition, before you get to your work, actually, we'll work backwards now because I asked it backwards. Is your plan, what are you releasing now and what's going on Al Torah? What's your plan to publish the whole thing?
Okay, so I guess I'll answer that question. I'm not sure if I'm going to go backwards or forwards, but I'll start from the beginning of my story with the Rechasim LaBikah and publishing it. So I was interested in the Sefer, like I told you before. I printed from the Al Torah, I printed the Sefer, and I started to use it. I had in Shul one, it was Yantif, it was Sukkot, and there was Yid sitting next to me in Shul I did not know, never saw him before. He's sitting next to me. And after the davening, he says, Shalom Aleichem, what sefer is that? I said, it's a Rechasim LaBikah, and do you know anything about it? He says, I actually do. Tells me his name, and he tells me that he's from Yerushalayim, and he does work for Al Torah, for Hillel Novetsky, and they actually are interested in getting the Rechasim LaBikah on their site. But it's a badly printed sefer. I mean, it wasn't badly printed for its day, but it hasn't been redone in 200 years. There's no good copies of it. And if I would be interested in getting to work on it, he'll put me in touch with Hillel Novetsky, which I did. And that got me started on this project. So normally you would print a sefer and get it published, and then Hillel Novetsky would hear about it and put it online. Here it's totally the other way around. He worked with me to get an OCR copy of the Sefer. I did a lot of work to correct it. I edited it. I fixed it up as much as I can, and I started footnoting it. With him, we put it up online. He has a great tool that helps find psukim, my citations. So he started with that, and basically we have the Torah up on his website, Al Torah, with the Rechasim LaBikah. A lot of it is footnoted by me, a lot of it is not. A lot of the footnotes that I have up there are raw, need correction. And a lot of the citations which are done by computer are not accurate. There are places where there are double psukim and he means a different one. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to correct that, but it's there. So if anybody wants to actually just read the Rechasim LaBikah, see what he has to say about any given pasuk, you can go online to alatorah.org. He has it in the Mikros Fidelis part. He has it as a sefer, a standalone sefer to look at, and it's there. Meantime, once I got started with that, I realized that this is really a missing sefer from any bookshelf, any library. It should be there. Although the Mechaber was not well known and the sefer was only used by specialists, I think that it's with the tools that we have, as well as the ability to do research and to rewrite and to edit. It's a sefer. Its time has come. So I started to work on it to get a physical print copy of the sefer. I spoke to the Zayis and they're interested in the project, and I started to work on it. But then, Baruch Hashem, I have a chasna coming up. My daughter's getting married, and I said to myself, that would be an opportune time to actually put out a hard copy, if not the whole thing, at least the chelak or roy liskabed. That will give it some mamashis. It will exist in the world. Maybe people will see it and like it. Maybe people will see it and critique it. But I think that would be the next step, where we'll have a physical edition out of part of it, and then Mr. Hashem will take that and develop it into a full sefer. So what we're putting out now, the first two Prakim on Bereshis, and like I said, the first two Prakim on Bereshis is, with my footnotes, as like 50 pages. So there's a lot there, and the chasna Mr. Hashem is before the Shabbos Parshas Kisisa. So I did Parshas Kisisa to add into it, to give it some flavor that's for that time. And also Parshas Kisisa is fascinating. There's a lot of interesting kedushin there. And I will backtrack because I owe you an explanation of that, the issue that he had with the Haskama, and that's in Parshas Kisisa. It's a fascinating piece, and it's eye-opening in how he thinks.
So, well, go ahead and talk about the Haskama, but one thing before, so I don't know if this episode will come out before Kisisa or not. If it will, we'll see, but I always put a disclaimer in because we record these so far in advance sometimes, but do you know at this point if it will be available anywhere? I used to be giving it up at the Chassidut, but will it be available to purchase? Do you know, or you don't know yet?
I don't know yet.
If it is available, then what I'll do is I'll include a link in the show's notes if there's a from Mali Zayas or it's available somewhere, and I also I record intro to the episode, so the listeners will already heard it unless you skip the intro, and I'll say in the intro it's available so and so, whatever. For not. And also, I will link to Torah just to the website for those interested in checking it out. But okay, now back to the Haskama.
Back to the Haskama. In the Haskama, this is considered he considers him a close friend. I don't know exactly, the age difference is somewhat interesting because I think the Akiva Wertheimer, from what I saw, was born in 1778, so he's considerably younger. But it seems like they were close friends anyway. And he writes in the middle of the Haskama, Gamal ze pakachti einai. Lo yinoke gvul asher gavlu rishain. I don't like something that he did. Now, before I read the rest of that piece in the Hakdam, I'll tell you what he did. In the Yud Gimel Midas, the counting of Yud Gimel Midas is a complicated sugya. I mentioned the footnotes that Shadal has 13 different ways going back to the Rishonim all the way to his day. But there are different ways to count what the Yud Gimel Midas are. The Rechasim LaBikah wants to say that Poikei Avain Avos, Al Banim, Al Bnei Banim, Al Shilation, Al Ribein, are four different midas of four dairas that HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Tova expands or gives room for the punishment to be spread out for someone who does Averis. And those four generations are Banim, Bnei Banim, Shilashim, and Ribein. Four generations past the Chayte himself. And on this, the Maskim, or the Akiva Wertheimer, says, Lo yinake gvul asher gavu rishonim b'harchivay oisa ad ribein, v'amarti derech hazeh lo yitach. I can't agree with this. However, Ach, Shnayim, Shlosha, Gargire, Pekois, 2 or 3 bad grapes. Lo yashchisu shesile gad al palge ma'im netuos. So I'm giving the Haskama. To this comment, the Rechasim LaBikah himself responds with a note at the end of the Sefer. And he says, I got a comment about this, and I understand that it's upsetting to him, or he maybe doesn't like it. However, he says, this is the way the pasuk is read. I'm not making this up. It's not my own idea. This is the proper way to read the pasuk. If it would be my own thought and you critiqued it, I would erase it. But I think it's correct in the reading of the pasuk, so I don't want to take it out. And this is interesting enough. But when I dug deeper into this and I looked at the Mefarshim, it turns out that really there's a lot more to this. And I don't want to get into the whole share here on the podcast, but basically it's really a maflekas from Ban Even Ezra. And there's a problem that in the Asaras Adibros it says Ban Bnei Ban Shalishim Ribein. I'm sorry, in the Yigul Midas it says Ban Bnei Ban Shalishim Ribein, and the Asaras Adibros it says Ban Ben Shalishim Ribein. So how do you reconcile the two? And the Ramban Kedarka goes that both of them mean the same thing, and it means $3. And then when Ezra goes that it's both of them mean the same thing, and it's $4. And what the Rechasim LaBikah wants to say is that it depends when it's l'toiva, when the Kadosh Baruch Hu is expressing his will to extend the einish, he'll do it for $4. When it's l'ra, that the abundant on Mason, on Avon of Hussein, then it's only $3. And that would resolve the steer. What I found interesting is going beyond that and looking at the footnotes on the Ma'or's Ramban. He quotes the Maharsham, who explains this Ramban, and he comes out with a kasha on the night of Yehuda based on this, because the night of Yehuda had a shiloh that came to him but someone who died, and he left in his tzava that he wants to give his from his nechasim for $4. And what does it mean $4? Does it mean including the mace or not including the mace? And the night of Yehuda comes out la'alacha that it's $4 beyond the person himself, and the Maharsham asks him from the Ramban, who says it's only $3. And basically, if you whenever my sefer comes out and you look at it, you'll see that according to the way that Rechasim LaBikah learns these psukim, you can be yasher the kasha of the Yehuda. So it comes out of a critique of the Kiva Bertan and the Haskama to his response and researching it further, and it comes out to be a very interesting parasha in general.
Fascinating. So, I mean, this is all going to be your notes. You're going to have a lot in the footnotes. Sounds like there's a lot there. And you said the footnotes are going to be extensive. In the sample, I guess, coming out now, are you writing an introduction, a bio of him? You're putting that in, or that's still a work for later on for the complete Sefer Mitzvah?
I am. It's somewhat raw, but I'm giving the basic information that I put together. A lot of it is from that article from Reb Zev Gotthold, a few pieces from the Trinity Tevel. I allude to some of those other articles that I found that speak about him in other places. So it's not a full bio, and we don't have any really hard facts about him. So I don't know if there's how much better it could be, but if it could be improved when the Sefer comes out, in the meantime, it's going to be there as a pretty raw, but informational enough that people can get an idea of who we're talking about.
And your plan is to finish the entire Sefer with the notes and publish the whole Sefer?
I'm planning to do that. I'm working towards that, yes.
I guess the final question would be, we've mentioned a couple times the style of the Sefer and the writing and how it's different than a lot of us. Who do you think would benefit, who would enjoy the Sefer?
So, in general, if you like Mefarshim on Chumash and you're curious to see something that you haven't seen before, I think that's number one. If you have the ability to focus, it's not something where you're going to open it up and Erev Shabbos and Friday night and say, I have a vort on the parsha, or let me find something. You're not going to find a vort on the parsha there unless you really ma'ayin. People who are interested in the Ksava Kabbalah, I think will love it because you'll see in its source the pieces that Ksava Kabbalah brings, which are a lot. You'll also see which ones the Ksava Kabbalah doesn't bring, and you'll be able to say to yourself, why did the Ksava Kabbalah prefer a different one over this one? What didn't he like about this chap? People who are into Shaddal, which is there, from what I'm hearing, there are more and more people that are into that. He's another person. But I think that those who are those people who learn of Shal Hirsch's Perushin, and people who really want to know more about that, because the Shal Hirsch again does not source, and he's kind of in a world unto himself. I think this is the first time I think we find the Sefer that's in that same cup, it's in that same lineage as Shal Hirsch, and you can compare and contrast and see sources and learn up and see differences. There are things which Hirsch says exactly the same thing, but exactly the opposite. I'll give you one more example because I think this is a great one. Many of them are Farshim and Rejoshim what it's referring to, but in the simple pshat, the Rechasim LaBikah says, and the dvash misala means that honey, meaning dates, sweet dates, come from Salah, come from palm trees that are planted in dry and rocky soil. And he says this is absolutely natural because when date trees are planted in dry land, the sun acts on it and it produces sweet grapes. Shachar Flavish learns the pshat exactly the same as the Rechasim LaBikah, and he says that it's talking about date trees that are growing in rocky soil. And he says this is a miracle that Hashem makes, that despite the fact that it's rocky soil, still the dates come out very sweet. So you see where he takes the exact same pshat, but he sees something different than Rechasim LaBikah saw.
Okay, so I'll link to all this stuff. And as I mentioned, I'll put you the email address, I'll link to Al Torah. If it's available, I'll link to that. And hopefully listeners enjoy this episode about an unknown, but to most people, commentator, and here's some examples, and they can look forward to either checking out the Sefer or Al Torah, or just checking it out or just learning about it. And thank you, Rabbi Eliezer, for joining.
And one more thing, another group of people that will enjoy the Sefer are those who are into the Rashbam and the Ezra, because that's obvious, and I overlooked that, but he does disagree very often or agree very often with the Rashbam. So that's a very big another point that's important.
Okay. So we look forward to the sample and to the entire Sefer. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.